This is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. This is my last EWA radio episode. Longtime public editor Emily Richmond will be done with her fellowship right after National Seminar and will be returning in June to EWA. She'll take over the podcast then. I've been thinking a lot of who I wanted for this episode, and I am delighted to welcome C.D. Davidson Hyers. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me, C.D.
Oh my goodness, Kavitha, the honor is mine.
So you're a bit of an unusual guest because you're also my colleague at the Education Writers Association. So I want to explain why I asked you on. Mm-hmm. There are two reasons. So one is because of a fantastic piece you wrote for Pointer on mental health, specifically your mental health journey. It's called Covering the COVID-19 Pandemic. I Burnt Out. Recovery Brings Me Back. The second reason is, CD, you represent all the amazing reporters I've connected with this year.
Oh, goodness.
I thought I knew a lot of education reporters from working on the beat for more than 20 years, but almost every day in this job, there was someone I would speak to and I would think, how could I not have known this person existed before today? They're just fantastic. So you are the stand-in. You are the stand-in for amazing education journalists. No pressure. Welcome to EWA Radio.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Kavitha. And again, I cannot emphasize the honor is mine. You've been you are a wonderful colleague. So thank you for having me.
This is a very important topic to me because as public editor, mental health was the number one reason reporters reached out to me. Yes, they called about a story idea or asked for help finding experts or to get, say, the Cliff Notes version of the education reform movement. But the main reason, which really surprised me, was mental health. And oftentimes, CD, journalists felt they were the only ones feeling this way.
Yeah.
And they're not. One stat that you actually sent me was more than 70% of local journalists are experiencing moderate to high levels of personal and work-related burnout, according to a survey of more than 500 US journalists. And this is a survey post-pandemic. So I think I want to use this episode to make it clear that journalists who feel like this are not alone. Can you start by reading out a bit of your piece from It Had Been Months?
Sure. Yeah, so that's right in the introduction for this. After I had, I was talking to a war correspondent actually about what I was feeling, what I was experiencing that was so confusing and overwhelming. And I say, it had been months since I'd quit a job I loved, feeling somehow responsible for everything I'd witnessed and couldn't change. I used to write about local public K-12 education before the pandemic shuttered Florida. I also started writing about state virus data. For a year, I covered 2 breaking news beats, and people were dying in both. In Florida, we've lost more than 86,000 people to the virus, not even counting for those who suffer the extremes of long COVID. In terms of death alone, the Titanic has sunk more than 57 times.
That is so powerful. Take me back to that time, CD. You were 25. How were you feeling?
How was I feeling?
Yeah.
Overwhelmed and confused. And I start with overwhelmed, but honestly, Kavitha, figuring out how to put words to this has been more than a year long journey, and with a lot of support. So at the time, what I felt was confused. What I felt was incredibly guilty, and parsing through that has given me the ability to talk more about what it was I was also feeling. So overwhelmed, burnt out, exhausted. It felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders and I didn't measure up, which I want to emphasize early on in this episode with you that I'm incredibly grateful to you for for giving me the time to talk about this. And I am also now able to talk about this because the amount of work and support and family and friends and love that I've had and let myself experience since then. So I want to start there too.
So you were feeling really, really low, for want of a better word, and then the vaccines became available, and you wrote pieces about that. You started getting tons of calls and emails and texts from people you didn't know, who were stressed, who wanted to know where they could sign up, who were just craving more information. You became essentially a one-person help desk, and you were featured on national news outlets. You write, I was called a hero. I hated being called a hero. I wanted to be told to rest, that I'd done enough. I wanted someone to tell me when to stop. Soon I'd realize a choice before me, saving my job or saving my life. Tell us what's going on then.
Yeah, so that's it was a profound experience. It goes into how journalism ultimately, especially local journalism or journalism that has that local community heart to it, is a public service. And during the pandemic, but I think that this is true in any crisis, journalists are first responders when they are the first ones on the scene, or they're the first line of information for a community, because a community, when they're looking for a response to a crisis, they're also looking for information. And at that time, during the pandemic, we all knew so little because it was so new. So even the experts that, as a journalist, you would be consulting people who have studied this topic and know the answers to your questions, those people did not have answers. And so as my community felt adrift, I also felt adrift. And there was a wild lack of support everywhere. Specifically, I did not have support in place, which was also a product of the pandemic itself. The thought, I lived alone in an apartment. I had my dog and my cat. But, the thought of going home to my parents even was like, am I putting them at risk? So it felt like every way I was turning was a roadblock, like being in a maze, blindfolded and feeling an obstacle in front of me. While at the same time, when I'm answering people's questions with the little bit of information that I knew, which to some people felt like a mile ahead of them, to me, it felt like a couple inches in front of them. And ultimately, I started saying, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, which I think a lot of people really responded to. Finally, someone saying, I honestly don't know.
Right.
But to answer your hero part was like, I started receiving accolades after that. And it just felt like, not even the simplicity of, hey, this is my job, but hey, I don't really feel like I'm making a difference because nobody has an answer. So please don't call me a hero. I'm not making any change. Since then, the hero thing is still something that, I have lots of thoughts and feelings about, but I think that to talk to other journalists, it's like, at least holding the information and distributing it, doing the very tenet of our job is helpful to people. Ultimately, our job is so incredibly helpful. And even to say, I don't know is helpful.
It made me feel so hopeful, CD, reading your article, that you come out of it with such a sense of hope and kind of belief in journalism. And that made me kind of really happy.
I'm happy to hear that.
You left the job you loved. You traveled some, you moved back in with your parents, you started therapy. I know you've said you feel in a space where you're able to speak about your experience. Would you say you're back to who you were?
Never. I will never be that person again. but the person I am now, I love and adore. There is a knowledge that I have of myself, which I can now give to this profession in a way that I feel much more in control of. I think the word that everyone searches for to describe that is boundaries. I
Mm-hmm.
know what I can say no to. I know how to say no. I know how to hold that line of what I can take on now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a different version of myself. And there is a really big process to this of grief as well. I personally lost a couple of people during the pandemic, a mixture of life
Mm-hmm.
and the virus. And it wasn't just grief for them, but, you know, a profound grief for myself as well. And I think that collective trauma that we have all experienced is so scary and we all react to it differently. But for me, it was facing the grief there too.
I have to say, to come back to your piece, CD, I usually don't like first person pieces, and
Very
I
journalistic of you, yes.
and this is like showing my age. I usually don't like first person pieces, especially when they're
Hmm.
from like really young people. And to
Hmm.
me, if you're in your 20s, you're really young. Mostly because mostly because I feel that it's a little clickbaity. But I
Hmm.
loved your piece because I felt it wasn't just the tone that was different, but the intention of writing it was different.
Mm. Mm.
Why did you write about something so personal?
Yes, well, actually, really thank you for asking that question because a lot of thought went into writing this. The first time I sat down to write it was a bit of a zoomy phase. Like it just came out in about 30 minutes. But a lot of thought went into this, and the biggest reason I decided to write this, that I wanted to send it to Pointer, was because they had also written about me, interviewed me during COVID. There's a lovely, wonderful woman there named Kristen Hare who covers a lot of local journalism. So she's a journalist who writes about journalists, rather rare. Um, and it goes back to the hero, the being interviewed by national outlets, was again the accolade. I wanted to demonstrate, I wanted to show, the internal for what had already been so well covered externally, if that makes sense. Like the cost to uh, what was considered, or held up as an example of what journalism could do or what local journalism could do, like this really vaulted example. I wanted to say, okay, there's a cost to that,
Mhm,
and this is what it was for me.
mhm. I think that's just so, it makes total sense and is so beautifully put. I also want to say the reason I said I don't like first person pieces, especially by young people, is not because of their age per se. It's because I feel they haven't had the life experience to kind of process
Oh,
some of what
sure,
they've
sure.
gone through. Um, in reading this, I've known you for almost exactly a year, and in reading it, I felt I hadn't known you at all. Like, or rather, there was so much I didn't know about you, and that made me think about, the layers education reporters, like everyone else, carry around. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, when all this was going on, and you were under a tremendous amount of stress and feeling completely hopeless. I think in one bit you said, I sat on my kitchen floor staring at the ceiling for
Oh
hours.
yeah, I laid on my kitchen floor and stared at the ceiling. Yeah.
Mhm. How were you showing up at work?
Well, we had retreated to our houses by that time.
Uh-huh.
So it was Zoom meetings in the mornings.
And how did you come across then?
I don't know. It's it would be interesting to ask colleagues at that time what they thought. To me, I felt that I was telling people, because I wasn't concealing the fact that reporting on COVID, reporting on education was terrible. And I would be vocal about the fact that, like, my day today is going to look like catching a morning report, which to the best of my memory came out between like 7 and 9 or 8 and 10. I can't remember exactly. And then, about 4 to 6 or 6 to 7 in the evenings. And then on Tuesdays, I would cover school board meetings that sometimes I'd be turning stories in at 1 o'clock in the morning. But, it felt like such there's a better word, but, a cauldron, a pressure cooker. There we go. A pressure cooker that I just kept going. I'm sure I came across as stressed. I was trying to, the best I could, tell people, like, this is so much.
Mm-hmm.
And then it got to, this is too much.
Mm-hmm.
But I just kept going. And one of the things I realized, after that is, it's one thing to tell people what you're going through, and it's another thing to also show up for yourself and begin to also listen to what it is you are saying out loud.
Some of it also is the additional pressure I think women and minority groups feel that we have to show we're tough enough to be reporters, right? So many times I hear from reporters and they say, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And the worst thing they're worried about is that they cried during a meeting. Not an interview, a meeting with their editor. And I always say to them, tears release stress hormones.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to interrupt, but now whenever anyone around me starts crying, I'm like, good, do it.
Absolutely. I mean, why should I get a heart attack, bottling it all up? And I always tell people, like, sometimes I've had editors who have punched walls, who have rearranged furnitures, who have screamed.
Rearranged furniture is a very nice euphemism.
Who have, raised their voices or, resigned and walked out dramatically only to come back like the next day. Like all of this. And we never, that is somehow seen as acceptable.
Yeah.
But crying is not seen as acceptable. And I think we need to kind of rethink that.
I agree.
I remember when I was a student, CD, and someone from the 911 call center, local 911 call center, came to talk to our class. And I asked her how she and her colleagues coped with the stress after work. And she said, oh, we drink. And everyone laughed, Well, obviously that's not a very healthy way. But I was wondering if you could talk about some of what you found useful to do for yourself. And then we'll talk a little bit about maybe how editors and newsrooms can support journalists.
Sure. So it's interesting you bring up that example, because I talk about this in the Pointer article. I don't drink anymore. It's been at the end of June, it'll be about a year since I had my last drink. And I phrase it that way because during the pandemic, I drank more, significantly more. And it was a way that I didn't have to be responsible for what was happening around me anymore. I was a journalist all day, and then I would have some bourbon. And because I hadn't had alcohol, the same way as, not wanting to drink and drive, it would be, I'm not going to drink and report. And then I started, developing the association of, okay, if I've had alcohol, I don't have to be a journalist. And then alcohol is the only way that I get a reprieve from this. So part of recovery has been taking away what those pandemic developed coping mechanisms were, to start to see who I am without them, and analyzing what and where stress comes from and how I respond to it, and digging into that, which I want to emphasize has again been with the help of a professional. It's a terrifying thing to say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to use the tools that I developed to cope with the things that scare me the most. It's like jumping into the void and hoping there's something in there to catch you, but also terrified of what that's going to be.
Mhm.
So,
I know you leaned on family and friends,
mhm.
pets. You have a lot of animals around you.
Yes, grew up on a
Yeah.
farm, very used to it. Yes.
Um, you found a therapist that specializes in ED. Yeah.
EMDR. Yes, I found a therapist who specializes in trauma, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR.
I know it really helped you. And like I said, we both of us have zero training as therapists ourselves.
Yes.
I want to make that clear. And it
Yes.
could, for some people, medication might help. For some people,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
meditation might help. For
Mhm.
some people, it's being out in nature or
Mhm.
exercising or
Mhm.
um, I think very often what I've found is that when I am feeling low, then everything I've done is awful. And so what I used to do is keep a folder of times when people have written to me and they've said like, thanks for helping, or this made a
Mhm.
difference. And I've forced myself to look at it to be like,
Mhm.
am I considering the whole picture, or am I kind of reporting in a biased way on myself? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And that helped.
Yeah.
Um,
And all the things you're listing out, emphasizing again, I'm not a therapist, but all the things that you're listing out too are getting the mind and the body working together, And
Mhm.
and journalists, we're all very, very smart, very intellectual people, and we also all have bodies. That for me, I forgot about the importance of checking in on it that way. So.
Mhm. Often, when I speak to reporters, who are calling about feeling stressed or upset, I say to them, at the end of the conversation, you'll get through this.
Mhm.
I've read how thoughtful their pieces are. I hear them speak, in a weird way. It's like I feel how genuine their heart is, and I just know with support they will get through this.
Mhm.
But after reading your piece, I wondered, when I say you'll get through this, what do reporters hear? Right? It's
Mm.
not just what you're saying. So when you were feeling low, what did you want to hear from colleagues or your editor? Like, how could your newsroom have helped?
Mm. It's a very big question, and I appreciate you asking it. Part of my answer, I want to go ahead and re-acknowledge the fact that we were all experiencing a global health crisis that none of us had any, previous experience with. So I want to extend the empathy for that. But in answering your question, there were no discussions about even mental health. This was also, the pandemic came in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and how visual and traumatic, nationally traumatizing that was. We also were asking for, we need to talk about race in our newsroom, in our coverage, and that was dismissed or diminished as well. There was like, okay, we have to get back to our jobs and serving our community. But
Mhm.
it's like, no, to serve our community, we first need to serve ourselves. Um, so I think, to each newsroom their own, but recognizing that the people you have in your newsroom are people, and that the experiences that they have are going to affect their coverage. And we always talk about, not wanting to appear biased, which I think is a myth. We have our biases, we have our experiences that lead us to make decisions. And I'm queer, and I experience the world differently than somebody who is completely straight, and that's good, and that's okay, and that's important. But being able to talk about that openly is as important to our coverage as being able to cite the data that supports the story that you're doing. So my answer would be not being afraid, or actually, let me revise this before I even answer, is yeah, be afraid of the big conversations. Have them anyway. You're going to get things wrong within your newsroom. Do it. Get it wrong. rely on your colleagues, have these conversations, and your coverage gets so much better.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you brought this up, because my number one point of what I thought editors and newsrooms could do to support journalists, and this is not just when there's a crisis or when you notice someone is feeling, but just to bake it into your everyday kind of life, is ask. Just ask reporters how you're feeling. Just
Yes.
check in. It's something so simple.
Yes.
We check in about, oh, how's the edit going, or
have you gotten through to your source? Yeah. How was that interview? Yeah.
Exactly. It's just so simple to say, hey, how are you feeling? And every conversation doesn't have to be like a deep, bare your soul conversation.
No.
It's just like keeping that line open and signaling, I'm here if you want to talk.
Yes. And I think also too, there are some questions that help, which, help bridge the gap between different experiences. Because I think in my newsroom, at least, there seemed to be a sentiment that, leadership had to have all the answers, or had to have had all of the experience of all the reporters, and not get something wrong. And it's like, no, that's way too much for a single person.
Right.
Questions of like, what do you need from me right now? What do you need from me today? What do you need from me this week? What does support look like to you? Are you feeling listened to? Are you feeling like I have given you, or that you have the tools to complete this? Asking those questions that let somebody tell you what works for them.
Bringing it up during editorial meetings, like, how is everyone feeling? Normalizing it. If someone is covering something particularly stressful, that's a good time to think about, like, if they want to talk, if they want some time off, let reporters take time off, and don't penalize them when they come back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of journalists, myself included, it was like, why would I take time off right now? Because I feel like I'm in the middle of something, or there was always an excuse. I feel like I'm in the middle of something, or I feel like I'm watching the reaction to something. And when I get back, it will be more work. And it's like, no, take time off. That's that boundaries thing again, like enforcing your own boundaries to yourself is so difficult too.
I think for a long time also, CD, we didn't think of education reporters needing this. Needing to talk about mental
health. Which is wild to me, because, on the edge, I'm interrupting you.
No, you're fine.
Recognize that, but, it's wild to me, because the ed beat, you have school shootings. Like, there's no other beat that has school shootings, like there are mass shootings. But like that one detail is, yeah, you're gonna be a first responder, first on the scene of a crisis, no doubt.
And school shootings is definitely like a possibility, but also, as Nicole Carr, who's a reporter for ProPublica, who I admire greatly, we were talking once, and she said, "This ain't your mama's education beat." And I thought, oh my God, that should be put on a t-shirt.
Yes,
because
definitely.
Now when people call, they need a police escort during school board meetings, or they're doxxed online, or someone told their children hateful things about them, or they're getting vicious emails about how they hate America. And these are all examples from people I have spoken to, like, this year.
Yes.
So, it is very stressful.
It is
now.
Online harassment. It is physical and verbal abuse. It is gaslighting. It is, we're watching national politics, local politics, using and weaponizing information. And the crux of that, or the crossroads of that, is the education reporter. And education reporters also, sometimes are the only ones covering that beat in their newsroom, and are going to be treated as like general assignment at times. So there have been times that I've been pulled into covering. During the pandemic, I covered a gruesome double homicide. I covered shootings, teen violence shootings that left multiple teens dead. And, everything goes back to the classroom. And as a nation, we recognize this, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the people bearing the brunt of that are the ed reporters.
Mm-hmm. What happened after the piece was published?
Well, I went outside and spent a lot of time offline, digging in the dirt in a garden, just being like, okay, this has happened. I've written this. That is okay. I'm ready. And then that was, the one day after it published. And then the next day I came back online. And it was lovely. I received so many messages from people saying thank you for having written this, because same. And that was the most profound of, some senior editors at publications even reaching out, being like, you have articulated something that I've been feeling for a long time. Thank you. And I'm getting a little choked up thinking about it, but that was the validation of, I'm not trying to write this to say woe is me or look at how hard this was for me. I'm trying to say this was really hard for me and I'm not the only one. And that was the response that I started seeing from people.
Mm-hmm. I want to give you the last thought, CD. I always think on the podcast, I've started doing this where, when we meet someone we interview, like for an in-depth piece, I feel like we are changed permanently a little bit by them and they are changed permanently a little bit by us. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, how have you been changed? What is the one thing you will take away from writing this piece? Not for a moment, but forever.
That is a wonderful question, Kavitha. Thank you for asking it.
CD, like we are taught as audio reporters, whenever you ask a question and someone says, that's a great question, like one, it means they're stalling for time. And two, you have to delete that compliment.
Well, you could leave one in there, but yes, you absolutely called me on the stalling for time. To answer your question, because it was a good question, so often I speak from my personal experience and then listening to colleagues as well. And this is going to fold into minority experiences, inclusive of women, trans folks, queer folks, people of color, is that we think, okay, this is my reaction. This is my perspective. Maybe I'm wrong. And from writing this piece, I have reoriented myself to, this is my reaction, this is my perspective, and that is important. And the profound shift in being able to validate myself first to figure out how I am going to respond to something has been incredible, because it doesn't matter if the situation is calm. I'm reacting to something, and that is important because I trust myself. And I trust that if I'm reacting, there's a reason. And so my final answer to your question is, it is okay for something to be too much. It is okay for you to react. It is not okay for you to make your feelings somebody else's responsibility, but it's okay. It is important for you to have them.
CD, I feel like you need your own podcast. We've been talking to CD Davidson Hires, membership coordinator for EWA and author of a wonderful first-person piece in Pointer about her mental health journey. You can follow her on Twitter at Davidson Hires. That's HIERS. Thank you so much for being open, CD.
My goodness, Kavitha, thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation.
We will have some resources on our website at ewa.org. And as always, you can call your public editor. That wraps up this episode, my final episode hosting EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Do you have any questions or would you like to share your experiences? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA and Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.